Arthur sat in his silent office, staring at 3 black titanium cards on his mahogany desk. To most, these were just pieces of plastic, but today, they were a trap for the truths. He had everything a man could dream of, yet his heart felt like an empty bank vault. He watched his fiancée, Sienna, through the glass, laughing as she browsed a jewelry catalog on her gold-plated tablet. Beside her, Billionaire, his ambitious business partner, checked the stock market with a cold, hungry gaze. Then there was Clara the maid, quietly polishing the floor near their feet, her shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear into the shadows. Arthur picked up the cards, his fingers tracing the cold edges. He was about to give these women the power to spend millions, not out of love, but to see who would finally break his trust. He didn't know that the small, quiet woman cleaning the floor was about to buy something that would shatter his entire world. Arthur did not look away from the glass window for a long time. The office air felt heavy with the scent of expensive leather and cold ambition. Sienna was now holding a diamond ring up to the sunlight. She laughed and the sound carried through the hallway. It was a sharp and hollow sound. She did not know Arthur was watching her every move. She did not know that his trust was already beginning to fray like an old rope. Billionaire sat across from her with a stiff back. Billionaire was a woman who saw people as numbers on a balance sheet. She checked her gold watch and tapped her pen against the mahogany table. Below them, Clara was on her hands and knees. She was scrubbing a small coffee stain near the edge of the rug. Her movements were slow and methodical. She looked tired. Her simple uniform was faded from too many washes. Arthur noticed a small patch on the shoulder of her dress. It was sewn with careful and uneven stitches. He looked back at Sienna, who was now complaining about the vintage of the wine. She had everything she ever asked for. She lived in a house with 12 bedrooms. She drove a car that cost more than most people earned in 5 years. But Arthur saw a hunger in her eyes that never seemed to go away. It was a hunger for more status and more power. He felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He looked at the 3 black titanium cards again. They represented a fortune without limits. He had spent his whole life building this empire from nothing. He remembered sleeping on the floor of a small warehouse when he started. He remembered the weight of debt and the fear of failing. Now he was at the top, but he felt more vulnerable than ever. He needed to know who truly stood by him and who was just waiting for his fall. He stood up and adjusted his suit jacket. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He walked out of the office and into the sitting room. The laughter stopped immediately. Sienna smiled at him, but it did not reach her eyes. Billionaire closed her laptop and stood up. Clara did not look up. She kept scrubbing the floor with her head bowed low. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out the 3 cards. He set them on the table one by one. The metal clicked against the wood. He told them that he was leaving for a business trip to Europe for 1 week. He said that while he was gone they each had a card with no limit. He told them to buy whatever their hearts desired. Sienna gasped and grabbed the first card. Her fingers brushed Arthur's hand, but she was looking at the titanium. Billionaire took the second card with a calm nod. She was already calculating her next move. Then Arthur turned to Clara. He held out the 3rd card. Clara stopped scrubbing. She looked at the card and then at Arthur's face. Her eyes were wide with genuine confusion. She wiped her wet hands on her apron before reaching out. She took the card with trembling fingers as if it were a hot coal. Billionaire let out a small and mocking snort. Sienna rolled her eyes and turned back to her magazine. Arthur watched Clara tuck the card into her pocket. She looked smaller than before. He wondered if she would even spend a single dollar. He wondered if he was making a huge mistake. He told them he would see them in 7 days. He walked toward the door without looking back. As he stepped into his waiting car, he felt a strange pressure in the air. The test had begun. He pulled out his phone and opened the banking app. He waited for the first notification to appear. He knew Sienna and Billionaire would not wait an hour. But as the miles passed and the city lights faded, he kept looking at the screen. The card belonging to Clara remained silent. There was not a single transaction. Not even for a cup of coffee. He frowned and leaned back against the seat. What was she waiting for? Arthur sat in his leather car seat while the city lights blurred outside his window. His phone remained silent on his lap. He checked the banking app every few miles. Sienna had already spent $12,000 at a boutique on Fifth Avenue. Eleanor had booked a luxury suite for a business retreat that cost $20,000. Both notifications appeared within 20 minutes of his departure. But this third card belonged to Clara. It showed zero activity. Arthur looked at the screen and felt a strange heaviness in his chest. He remembered the way her hands shook when she took the card. He remembered the small patch on her shoulder. He wondered if she was too afraid to even buy a meal. The car moved toward the airport, but Arthur's mind stayed in that mansion. He thought about the laughter of Sienna and the cold calculations of Eleanor. They were spending his money like it was water. He had expected that. He had planned for that. But Clara was different. She was a ghost in his own home. She cleaned the messes they made. She stood in the shadows while they argued. Arthur leaned his head back and closed his eyes. He tried to focus on his business trip, but the silence from the third card was louder than the engine. 1 hour passed, then 2. He reached the private terminal and stepped out into the cool night air. Just as he walked toward the plane, his phone vibrated. He stopped mid-step. He pulled the device from his pocket. A notification appeared from the bank. The card had finally been used. Arthur expected to see a charge from a grocery store or a department store. Instead, the location was a small bakery in a neighborhood he had not visited in years. The amount was only $15. Arthur stared at the numbers. $15. Sienna had just bought a pair of shoes that cost more than Clara's entire monthly salary. He watched the screen. 5 minutes later, another notification arrived. This one was from a pharmacy next to the bakery. The amount was $42. Arthur frowned. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. He knew that neighborhood. It was where the people who worked his factories lived. It was a place of broken sidewalks and dim streetlights. Why was she there? Why was she spending so little? He boarded the plane, but he did not sit down. He paced the narrow aisle while the pilots prepared for takeoff. He pulled up the GPS tracker linked to the cards. He saw the red dot representing Clara's card moving slowly. It stopped at a street corner near an old apartment building. Arthur watched the dot stay still for 10 minutes. He felt a sudden urge to call the house and ask for her. But he stopped himself. This was a test. He had to let it play out. He sat in his seat and buckled the belt. The plane began to roll down the runway. As the wheels left the ground, he saw one more notification. It was a charge for $800. The location was a medical supply company. Arthur felt his heart skip a beat. The quiet maid was finally spending his money. But she was not buying diamonds. He stared at the name of the company on his screen. It was a company that sold oxygen tanks and hospital beds. Arthur gripped the armrests of his seat. He realized he knew nothing about the woman who scrubbed his floors every morning. He realized that while the others were buying toys, she was buying time. But who was she buying it for? The plane climbed into the dark sky, leaving the city behind. Arthur stared out the window at the flickering lights below. He felt like he was flying away from the only truth he had ever found. He looked at his phone one last time before the signal faded. The red dot was still at that old apartment building. It was not moving. Clara was still there in the dark waiting for something Arthur could not see. The notifications on Arthur's phone were like heartbeats from two different worlds. Sienna and Eleanor were racing to see who could empty his vaults faster. Sienna had just spent $30,000 on a custom designer gown. Eleanor had purchased a high-end office suite in downtown Chicago for $50,000. But Clara's card was different. It spoke in whispers. A charge for $5 at a local bus station. A charge for $10 for a basic first aid kit. Arthur watched the red dot on the GPS map. It was deep in the heart of the industrial district. This was the place where the city's forgotten lived in the shadows of the very factories Arthur owned. He felt a cold sweat on his neck. He realized he had never actually looked at Clara's face while she worked. He only knew the sound of her brush against the floor. The plane leveled off at 30,000 feet. Arthur pulled out his laptop and began searching for the address where Clara's card had stopped. It was a crumbling brick building. Records showed it was a low-income hospice center. Most of its funding had been cut 2 months ago by Arthur's own board of directors. Billionaire had signed the papers to save costs. Arthur felt a sharp pain in his chest. He watched a new transaction appear. $800 for a portable oxygen concentrator. He looked at the limit he had given her. It was unlimited. She could have bought a mansion. She could have bought a fleet of cars. Instead, she was spending hundreds to save someone's breath. Arthur gripped his seat until his knuckles turned white. He thought about Sienna's diamond jewelry. He thought about Alina's corporate ambitions. They were taking his wealth to build their own pedestals. Clara was using his wealth to fill a gap he had created himself. He felt a sudden and powerful urge to tell the pilot to turn the plane around. He needed to know who Clara was helping. He needed to know why she didn't just ask him for the money. Was he so terrifying that his own staff felt they had to hide their kindness from him? The silence of the plane was heavy. The red dot remained at the hospice center. Clara was still there in the dark. She was holding a card that could change her life forever, but she was using it to change someone else's ending. Arthur closed his eyes, but he couldn't sleep. Every time he breathed, he thought about the oxygen tank Clara had just purchased. He realized that while he was testing them, they were actually revealing him. Arthur felt his world shifting. The billionaire was no longer the judge. He was the one under observation. What is Clara hiding in that old building, and why is she risking her job to do it? If you want to see if Arthur makes it back in time to find the truth, please like and subscribe to follow this journey. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Are you in Houston, Toronto, or maybe Sydney? Arthur stared at the red dot on his phone screen. It had been stationary for over 20 minutes. He looked out the airplane window at the thick clouds. He felt a deep sense of unease. He called his head of security, James. Arthur told him to find the exact history of that brick building. James promised to call back within 10 minutes. Arthur paced the small cabin of the private jet. He looked at the other credit card notifications. Sienna had just added a $5,000 charge at a luxury spa. Billionaire had spent $8,000 on a rare bottle of wine. Their spending was predictable and shallow. It was exactly what he expected. But Clara was still in that industrial district. The red dot was a silent accusation. James called back. He sounded hesitant. He said the building was the St. Jude Hospice Center. It was a place for patients with no family and no money. Arthur felt a cold shiver run down his spine. James continued. He said the center was scheduled for demolition next month. The land was being cleared for a new luxury high-rise. Arthur realized he was the one who signed the development contract. He had seen the hospice as just a line on a financial report. He had seen the residents as an obstacle to profit. Arthur sat down heavily in his seat. He looked at the transaction for the oxygen concentrator. Clara was not just buying time for someone. She was fighting against his own company. He felt a surge of guilt that made his hands shake. He pulled up his files and looked for Clara's employee record. He found her full name, Clara Thompson. She had worked for him for 3 years. She had never asked for a raise. She had never taken a sick day. He looked at her emergency contact. It was an elderly woman named Martha Thompson. The address matched the building in the industrial district. Arthur felt like the air in the cabin was running out. Clara was spending his money to save her own mother from his own business decisions. He realized his test was backfiring. He was the one being judged. He looked at the red dot again. Suddenly, it began to move. It was heading toward a local hardware store. 10 minutes later, a new charge appeared. $200 for heavy-duty locks and plywood. Arthur frowned. Why would a hospice center need plywood? He looked at the GPS dot moving back toward the brick building. It was late at night. The industrial district would be empty. He felt a sudden and powerful protective instinct. He realized Clara was not just spending money. She was preparing for a standoff. She was going to protect those people from the demolition crews. Arthur told the pilot to land at the nearest airport. He told him to prepare a car. He was going back. He had to see Clara's face. He had to know if he had lost his soul while building his empire. He watched the red dot return to the brick building and stop. Clara was inside now. She was waiting for the morning. She was waiting for his machines to arrive. He wondered if she knew he was coming. He wondered if she would ever forgive him for the pain he had caused without even knowing her name. The plane began its descent into the dark night. The private jet touched down on the tarmac with a muffled thud. Arthur did not wait for the stairs to fully extend. He hurried toward the black sedan waiting near the hangar. The night air was thick and heavy. He told the driver the address of the hospice center. The car tore through the empty streets of the industrial zone. Arthur looked at the GPS on his phone. The red dot was still there. It was a silent witness in the middle of the dark. He looked at the window of his car. The factories he built looked like giant metal monsters in the moonlight. He felt a sharp regret. He had created these steel walls, but he had forgotten the people inside them. He reached for his tablet and opened the demolition schedule. Billionaire had marked the St. Jude Hospice Center for total destruction. The date was tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Arthur felt a cold sweat on his palms. He realized why Clara was buying plywood and heavy locks. She was not just a maid. She was a soldier protecting the only thing her mother had left. The car stopped in front of the crumbling brick building. The streetlights were flickering. Shadows stretched long across the cracked sidewalk. Arthur stepped out of the car. The silence was pressing down on him. He walked toward the front entrance. He saw the new plywood covering the broken window frames. He saw the heavy chains wrapped around the door handles. He reached out and touched the cold metal. Suddenly he heard a sound from inside. It was a soft and rhythmic mechanical hum. It was the sound of the oxygen concentrator. He realized the transaction he saw on his phone was real. He stood there for a long moment. He felt like a stranger at his own gate. He knocked on the door. There was no answer. He knocked again and called Clara's name. Still silence. He looked up at the second floor. A thin sliver of light appeared behind a curtain. A face looked down at him. It was Clara. Her eyes were not full of fear. They were full of a hard and steady defiance. She did not move to open the door. She watched him like he was the enemy. Arthur felt his heart break. He was the most powerful man in the city, but he could not get past a wooden door. He pulled out his phone and sent a message to Billionaire. He told her to cancel the demolition immediately. He waited for a reply. 5 minutes passed. His phone vibrated. Billionaire replied that the contract was already in motion. She said stopping it now would cost millions in penalties. Arthur gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked back up at the window. Clara was gone. The light remained. He realized that saving the building was not enough. He had to save the trust he had destroyed. Just then a loud engine echoed in the distance. He looked toward the end of the block. A giant yellow bulldozer was slowly crawling toward them. It was only 2 blocks away. The morning was coming faster than he expected. Arthur stood in the middle of the road. He looked at the machine and then at the hospice. He had to make a choice. Would he stand with his empire or with the woman who taught him what mercy looked like? The bulldozer roared and the ground began to shake beneath his feet. Arthur stood in the middle of the dark asphalt road while the ground trembled under his feet. The massive yellow bulldozer was 100 yards away, and its headlights cut through the night like a predator's eyes. He looked at the heavy chains on the door of the hospice center and then at his phone. Billionaire had not sent another message. The corporate machine was moving, and it did not care about the faces inside those crumbling walls. Arthur turned his back on the machine and walked toward the building. He pounded on the plywood, covering the door with his bare fist. He called out for Clara again, and his voice was raw with desperation. He shouted that he was alone and that he was there to help. For a long minute, the only sound was the roar of the approaching engine. Then he heard the rattle of metal. The heavy chains slid against the handle, and a small gap appeared in the door. Clara stood there in the shadows, and her face was illuminated by the flickering streetlight. Her uniform was stained with dust, and her eyes were tired, but she did not look defeated. She asked him why he was there, and if he had come to finish what his company started. Arthur felt a sharp sting in his throat. He looked at her and said he didn't know about her mother. He said he didn't know anyone was still living here. Clara let out a cold and hollow laugh. She said that a billionaire never knows about the people underneath his buildings until they become an inconvenience. She told him that her mother Martha was inside and that she was breathing through an oxygen concentrator that Arthur's credit card had paid for. She said the irony was the only thing keeping her sane. The bulldozer was now only 1 block away, and the sound was deafening. Arthur reached out, but he did not touch her. He begged her to let him in so he could move them to safety. Clara did not move. She said her mother could not be moved because the stress would stop her heart. She told him they were staying, and that if the building fell, they would fall with it. Arthur looked at the giant machine and then at the quiet woman in the doorway. He realized that for the first time in his life, his money was useless. He couldn't buy his way out of this moment. He pulled out his phone and made a final call to the site foreman. He commanded him to stop the machine, but the foreman said the orders came directly from the board of directors. Billionaire had anticipated his change of heart and had locked the system. Arthur felt a cold sweat on his back. He realized his business partner was trying to force his hand. He looked at Clara and then at the dark hallway behind her. He saw a small framed photograph on a table near the entrance. It was a picture of 2 men in hard hats smiling in front of a half-finished bridge. Arthur's heart stopped. He recognized the man standing next to his younger self. It was Thomas Thompson, his first partner, who died saving him from a crane collapse 20 years ago. He looked at Clara and saw the same level gaze. The loop was finally tightening. Who was Clara truly, and why had she kept this secret while cleaning his floors for 3 years? Arthur stood frozen as the roar of the bulldozer vibrated through his very bones. The dust from the dry road swirled in the headlights. It created a ghost-like fog between him and the machine. He looked at Clara and then at the old photograph inside the hallway. The man in the hard hat was Thomas. He was the partner who had pushed Arthur out of the way of a falling steel beam 20 years ago. Thomas had died instantly. Arthur had built his fortune on the foundation of that sacrifice. Now he was about to bulldoze the only family Thomas had left. Arthur felt a cold, hollow void in his chest. Clara watched him with eyes that saw everything. She did not ask for mercy. She simply stood her ground. Arthur turned toward the approaching machine. He raised both of his hands high above his head. The foreman in the yellow cabin pulled the brake. The massive metal tracks ground to a halt just inches from Arthur's shoes. The silence that followed was terrifying. Arthur walked to the side of the bulldozer. He pulled his phone from his pocket. He called the site manager. He gave a direct order to withdraw all equipment immediately. The manager started to argue about the board of directors. Arthur cut him off with a voice that sounded like cracking ice. He told the manager that he was the owner, and the manager was fired if the machine stayed 1 more second. He watched the bulldozer slowly reverse. The headlights faded into the distance. Arthur turned back to the building. Clara was still there. She had not moved an inch. Arthur stepped toward the porch. He felt the weight of 20 years of ignorance pressing down on him. He told Clara that he knew who she was now. He said he recognized Thomas in the photograph. Clara's expression finally softened, but only slightly. She asked if that was why he was stopping. She asked if he only cared because of a debt from the past. Arthur looked at his hands. They were trembling. He realized he had been living in a beautiful mansion, while Thomas's wife and daughter lived in the shadow of his factories. He looked at the orange medicine bottles on the table inside. Clara had used his card to buy what he had taken away. He walked into the dark hallway. He saw Martha lying on a thin bed in the corner. She was pale and her breathing was shallow. The mechanical hum of the oxygen concentrator filled the small room. Arthur knelt beside the bed. He reached out to touch the old woman's hand, but he pulled back. He was a billionaire with no right to be in this room. He looked at Clara. She was standing by the door. She told him that her mother had been waiting for him. She said Martha never blamed him for the accident. She only wanted her daughter to have a life that didn't involve scrubbing floors. Arthur felt a surge of regret so strong he couldn't speak. He looked at the titanium card on the table. It was the key he had used to trap them, but Clara had used it to set them free from his own greed. He realized the test was over. He had failed, but he had found something far more valuable than gold. He looked at the shadows on the wall. He knew Elena would not let this go easily. She would fight him for the land. But Arthur didn't care about the land anymore. He only cared about the eyes staring at him from the hallway. Why had Clara stayed silent for 3 years while working in his house, and what was she planning to do next now that the secret was out? The roar of the bulldozer died away, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise. Arthur stood in the dim light of the hospice hallway, his eyes fixed on the old photograph. Thomas Thompson had been more than a business partner 20 years ago. He had been the man who gave Arthur his first chance in the construction world. When the crane snapped on that rainy afternoon in 1996, Thomas had not hesitated. He threw his body against Arthur, pushing him into a concrete trench just as the steel beam crushed everything else. Arthur had inherited the company and built a kingdom, but he had lost the man who made it possible. He looked at Clara, who was now standing by her mother's bed. Her hands were adjusting the flow of oxygen with practiced care. Arthur realized why she never asked for a raise or complained about the work. She had been watching him. She had been cleaning his floors while he signed orders to destroy her home. Clara finally turned to face him. She said that she knew about the accident from her mother's stories. She said that Martha had spent 20 years refusing to ask Arthur for help because she didn't want him to feel obligated by a debt of blood. But when the medical bills grew too high and the hospice was threatened, Clara had taken the job in his mansion to keep an eye on the man her father died for. Arthur felt a cold, hollow void in his chest. He looked at the orange medicine bottles on the nightstand. They were the same bottles he had seen on his phone screen. He realized Clara had used the card to buy a month of peace for a dying woman. Just then, his phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a video call from Sienna. He answered it without thinking. Sienna was standing in front of a mirror in a $3,000 silk robe. She laughed and asked when he was coming home because she had found a rare sapphire necklace that cost $200,000. Arthur looked at the screen and then at the pale, breathing form of Martha Thompson. The contrast was a physical blow to his stomach. He told Sienna to stay where she was, and then he hung up. He looked at Clara and said he was moving them to the best hospital in the city tonight. Clara shook her head slowly. She said it was too late for hospitals. She said her mother only wanted to die in a place that felt like home, not a glass tower owned by the man who forgot them. Arthur reached out to touch the wooden doorframe to steady himself. He was the owner of half the city, but he owned nothing of value in this room. Suddenly, the front door of the hospice creaked open. Elena stepped inside, her high heels clicking sharply on the linoleum. She was holding a tablet and looking at her watch. She looked at Arthur and then at Clara with a look of pure confusion. Elena asked Arthur why he was wasting time in a slum when the board of directors was waiting for the demolition report. She said the investors were losing money every minute the machines were idle. Arthur looked at his business partner and then at the maid. He saw the cold calculation in Elena's eyes. He realized that he had surrounded himself with people who loved his money but hated his soul. He took a step toward Elena and held out his hand. He told her to give him the tablet. Elena hesitated but handed it over. Arthur looked at the screen and saw the final signature needed to authorize the immediate clearing of the block. He looked at Clara one last time. He did not sign the report. Instead, he deleted the entire project file in front of Elena's eyes. Elena gasped and said he was ruining the company. Arthur looked at her and said he was finally building something that wouldn't fall down. But as Elena began to scream about lawsuits and contracts, a high-pitched alarm began to beep from the corner of the room. The oxygen concentrator was failing. Clara rushed to the bed, her face turning pale. Arthur looked at the card in his pocket. He had given them unlimited wealth, but now he was watching the one thing money could never replace slip away through his fingers. Arthur watched Eleanor's face turn a deep shade of purple as she realized the project was dead. He felt a strange lightness in his chest. He turned his attention back to the bed, where the alarm continued to scream. Clara was frantically checking the tubes and the power supply. The lights on the machine flickered and then went dark. The mechanical hums stopped. The room fell into a terrifying silence. Arthur looked at the titanium credit card on the floor. It was a cold piece of metal that couldn't breathe for Martha. Clara let out a choked sob and pressed her ear to her mother's chest. Arthur felt the walls of his empire crumbling around him. He realized that all his towers were built on the silence of people like Martha. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his private cell phone. He called the city's emergency grid manager. He spoke with a voice that commanded mountains to move. He told the manager to restore power to this specific block in 30 seconds, or he would buy the entire utility company and fire everyone by dawn. He stood over Clara and Martha with his jaw set tight. Eleanor tried to speak about liability, but Arthur didn't even look at her. He watched the small green light on the oxygen concentrator. Suddenly, the machine jumped back to life. The hum returned. Martha's chest rose with a deep and shaky breath. Clara collapsed against the side of the bed and buried her face in the blankets. Arthur stepped back toward the door. He saw Eleanor staring at him with pure hatred. She said that the board would remove him for this. She said he was no longer fit to lead. Arthur looked at her and said he was finally leading. He told Eleanor to leave the building and never return to his office. He watched her walk out into the night, and her heels clicked like a closing chapter. Arthur turned back to Clara. He saw her looking at the old photograph of Thomas. She asked Arthur if he remembered the day Thomas died. Arthur nodded slowly. He said he remembered the sound of the steel. Clara looked at him and said that Thomas had a letter in his pocket that day. She said the company lawyers took it and told Martha it was just business papers. Clara reached into her uniform and pulled out a yellowed envelope. She said it was the original letter her father wrote to his wife an hour before the accident. She handed it to Arthur. Arthur took it with trembling fingers. He opened the letter and read the first line. Thomas wrote that he was worried about Arthur. He wrote that Arthur was becoming obsessed with profit and was forgetting why they started. The letter said that if anything happened, Thomas wanted Arthur to take care of the people they built things for. Arthur felt a tear hit the paper. He looked at the medical bills on the table. He looked at the woman who had scrubbed his floors to pay for his mistakes. He realized the test was never about the 3 cards. The cards were just a way to see if he was still the man Thomas saved. Arthur looked at Clara and asked her why she waited 3 years to show him this. Clara looked at the oxygen machine and then at him. She said she was waiting to see if there was anything left of the man her father loved. But as Arthur began to apologize, a new shadow appeared at the front door. It was Sienna. She was wearing her designer gown and holding a small velvet box. She looked at the dirty room and then at Arthur. She asked if he was coming to the gala or if he was staying in this dump forever. Arthur looked at his fiancée and then at the maid holding her dying mother's hand. The final loop was about to close. What is inside Sienna's velvet box, and how will Arthur's final decision change the city forever? Arthur stood paralyzed by the hospital bed while Sienna's voice echoed through the cramped room. She looked at the peeling wallpaper and the stained linoleum with absolute disgust. Sienna clutched her designer handbag as if the air itself might ruin the leather. She told Arthur that the car was waiting outside and the gala started in 30 minutes. She said that important people were expecting them, and he was embarrassing her by staying in this dump. Arthur looked at the small velvet box in her hand and then at Clara. Clara was still kneeling on the floor, holding her mother's hand while the oxygen machine hummed. Arthur felt a cold wall rising between him and the woman he was supposed to marry. He asked Sienna if she knew what this building was. Sienna laughed and said it was a pile of bricks that should have been torn down weeks ago. She told him to stop acting like a saint and get in the car. Arthur looked at the letter from Thomas that was still in his hand. He realized that Sienna didn't care about the man who saved his life. She didn't care about the daughter who scrubbed their floors to buy medicine. He stepped toward Sienna, and his shadow covered her expensive gown. He told her that he was staying here, and she should go to the gala alone. Sienna's face twisted into a mask of rage. She said that if he stayed, she was leaving him for good. She held up the velvet box and said the ring inside was worth more than this entire neighborhood. Arthur looked at the box and then at Martha's pale face. He told Sienna to leave the ring on the table. Sienna gasped and threw the box onto the floor. The diamond ring rolled across the dusty tiles and stopped near Clara's worn shoes. Sienna turned around and walked out of the hospice, slamming the door so hard the plywood rattled. The silence returned, but it was broken by a soft sound from the bed. Martha's eyes were open. She looked at Arthur and whispered his name. Arthur knelt beside her and took her hand. He told her he was sorry for forgetting. Martha smiled weakly and said she knew he would come back eventually. She looked at Clara and then at the ring on the floor. She told Clara to pick it up. Clara hesitated but reached for the diamond. She looked at Arthur and asked if he really meant it. Arthur said that the money didn't matter anymore. He said he was going to rebuild this center and name it after Thomas. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look happy. She looked toward the hallway where Alina had disappeared. Clara said that Arthur was in danger. She said that Alina had been planning this for 3 years. Clara reached under the bed and pulled out a second envelope. She said this one wasn't from her father. She said it was a copy of a secret contract Alina had signed with a rival company to sell Arthur's entire empire the moment the hospice was destroyed. Arthur felt his heart turn to stone. He realized the demolition wasn't about land. It was about a total takeover. He looked at the contract and saw the date. The final transfer of power was happening in 2 hours. Arthur grabbed his phone, but the screen stayed black. The signal was gone. He looked at Clara and realized they were trapped. Someone had cut the wires outside. How will Arthur stop the theft of his life's work without a phone or a car, while his enemies are already celebrating at the gala? Arthur stared at the digital copy of the contract on the screen. He felt a cold sweat breaking across his forehead. The document was a predatory merger agreement. It was designed to strip him of his voting rights. Alina had arranged everything behind his back for months. He looked at Clara and then at the cut wires near the window. He realized they were effectively locked inside a dead zone. The gala was miles away in the city center. His rivals were already drinking champagne to his downfall. Arthur looked at the diamond ring still sitting on the floor. He picked it up and handed it to Clara. He told her to use it as collateral for any neighbor who had a working car. Clara took the ring and looked at her mother. She whispered a promise to be right back. She ran out the back door into the dark alley. Arthur stayed by Martha's side. He watched the steady rhythm of the oxygen concentrator. He felt the weight of his own signature on the demolition order. He checked his watch and saw they had only 90 minutes left. The silence in the room was suddenly broken by the sound of a distant police siren. Arthur looked out the window and saw a black SUV approaching. It was not the police. It was a private security team hired by the rival corporation. They were coming to ensure the building was empty for the final strike. Arthur realized Alina had lied about the legal penalties. She wanted him gone so he couldn't testify against the merger. He looked for a weapon but found only an old metal pipe near the sink. He stood by the door and waited. The SUV stopped and 4 men in suits stepped out. They began walking toward the porch. Arthur felt a surge of adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't a billionaire right now. He was a man protecting his past and his future. Just as the lead man reached for the door handle, a pair of headlights blinded the group. A rusty old delivery truck roared onto the sidewalk. Clara jumped out of the passenger seat. She was followed by a group of factory workers from the neighborhood. They were carrying heavy tools and flashlights. Clara pointed at the men in suits and told them to leave. The lead guard laughed and reached for his holster. Arthur stepped out onto the porch and stood next to Clara. He looked the guard in the eye and said he was the owner of the property. He told them to get off his land, or he would dismantle their lives by morning. The guards hesitated as more neighbors began to gather. Arthur felt a strange sense of belonging he had never found in his boardroom. He realized that while he was testing his staff for greed, they were testing him for humanity. He looked at the contract in his hand. He knew he had to get to the gala to stop the vote. But the guards were blocking the road. How will Arthur reach the city in time to save his company, and who is the mysterious person driving the delivery truck? That saved them. Arthur looked at the group of workers standing firmly on the porch. Their faces were etched with the grit of years spent in his own factories. He saw the way they looked at Clara with respect and at him with a cautious hope. He realized that Thomas had not just left a daughter behind. He had left a legacy of loyalty that money could never build. Arthur turned to the laid security guard and lowered his hand. He told the man that the confrontation was over. He said he was going to the city center and he needed a ride. The driver of the delivery truck stepped forward. It was an older man with gray hair and a faded company cap. He looked at Arthur and said he used to work for Thomas. He told Arthur that the truck was slow, but it would get him there. Arthur climbed into the dusty passenger seat. Clara stood by her mother and watched the truck pull away. Arthur arrived at the gala just as the final vote was about to begin. The room was filled with the scent of expensive perfume and cold ambition. Billionaire was standing on the stage with a microphone in her hand. She was smiling at the crowd and preparing to announce the merger. Arthur pushed through the heavy oak doors. He was still wearing his rumpled suit, and his shoes were covered in industrial dust. The room went silent. Billionaire's smile vanished. Arthur walked down the center aisle and stepped onto the stage. He took the secret contract from his pocket and held it up for everyone to see. He spoke into the microphone, and his voice was calm and steady. He told the investors that the merger was based on a lie. He revealed that Billionaire had planned to strip their assets for a rival firm. The board members began to murmur in shock. Billionaire tried to shout him down, but the evidence was undeniable. Arthur didn't stop there. He announced that he was creating the Thompson Hospice Foundation. He pledged half of his personal fortune to rebuild the neighborhood his factories had overshadowed. The room exploded into a different kind of noise. It was the sound of a legacy finally being honored. Arthur looked out at the sea of wealthy faces and realized he was finally free from the test. He returned to the hospice later that night. Martha was stable and the power was back on. Clara was sitting by the window. She looked at him and didn't say a word. She simply nodded. It was the only validation Arthur ever truly needed. He realized that $1 billion is just a number until you use it to save a single life. This story reminds us that true wealth is measured by the people we protect and the promises we keep. If you believe that everyone deserves a home and a chance at dignity, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of justice and heart. What would you have done if you found a secret that could destroy your boss but save your family? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.